The Healesville and Yarra Glen Guardian reported on the 22nd of June, 1907. Quote, "The departure was made in the teeth of a terrible gale, but there was as much confidence in the ship as there was in the capacity of Captain Precious, the senior captain of the Great Eastern Company's fleet. Both had weathered many a storm in the North Sea. Rarely, however, has the North Sea seen such a storm as that which burst over it the night of the terrible disaster."
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, "The Berlin in View of the Hook"?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Berlin was a two-screw, steel-hulled steamship that had been built in 1894 for the Great Eastern Railway Company. 1,775-ton ship was considered a very good vessel, and she had been completely overhauled and had gotten new boilers put in during the fall of 1906 at the cost of $32,000, showing that the railway company hoped for her to continue to carry its passengers for many years to come. The crew and officers on the ship also spoke of the ship's importance to the company. Captain Precious had started to work for the company in 1876 as a boy. He had become an able-bodied seaman in 1880, worked his way up to second mate as quickly as 1881, was a chief officer in 1883, and a captain in 1892. He had been working on the Harwich to Hook of Holland route, on which the Berlin was employed for the past 15 years. The chief officer did not have as long of a service record with the company, but he had worked on the Berlin for the past 6 years, and held a master's certificate, so he could be considered more than qualified for the position. The second officer had been with the company since 1899, and the able-bodied seamen were also all long-time employees of the company, with one having been employed for 2 years longer than Captain Precious even. The Berlin was an important ship to the Great Eastern Railway Company, and the crew they entrusted her with reflected that. On the 20th of February, 1907, the Berlin departed from Parks and Quay in Harwich to head to the Hook of Holland. There was already a storm blowing as she left, but as part of what was called the rapid service, it was expected that she would still sail in such weather, and it was not conditions that she had not sailed in previously without difficulty. On board, she carried 91 passengers and 50 crew members. The confidence of the crew as they departed proved justified. That night, the Berlin did indeed fight her way through the storm without too much difficulty, even though at times the winds were reportedly traveling up to 100 miles an hour. By the next morning, they were in sight of the Hook of Holland, and they were only an hour behind schedule in spite of the storm. A testimony to the seaworthiness of the Berlin. The next challenge was that they were going to need to enter the channel at the entrance of the Maas River, but the winds, which were coming from the northwest, had not slackened any, and were blowing against the ship broadside, right across the entrance to the channel. Captain Precious, undeterred, made for the channel entrance. It would be a decision that would later be much discussed. At least one local pilot stated that it should never be attempted, and that Captain Precious should have waited until the tides changed to aid him. Meanwhile, Captain Dale of the Clacton, a Great Eastern Railway Company cargo vessel that had departed from Harwich at the same time as the Berlin, would say that not only was it a matter of course to head for the channel entrance in spite of the conditions, but that he had actually intended to, except that a large wave had knocked him off his course, and he had been forced to change his plans. The Clacton would not be the only ship that would be hit heavily broadside by the heavy seas. Ahead of her the Berlin was traveling at a speed of approximately 15 knots toward the entrance of the new waterway, and had already reached the gas buoy when she was struck on her port side, knocking her about 5 points to the north of her intended course. Since the Berlin was closer to the entrance of the waterway than the Clacton had been when she had been hit, it was a much more delicate matter to correct than simply changing her approach. Reacting quickly as the Berlin's helm was put hard to port, the starboard engines were reversed, so they were now going full speed astern, while the port engines were kept full speed ahead. The ship was successfully turned to face the southwest in this manner, but the tide, winds, and waves were still acting on her and were carrying her toward the breakwater. Though the ship was now pointed in the desired direction, it was too late for them to get her clear of the danger. At 4:40 a.m. on the 21st of February, the waves carried her directly into the northernmost point of the breakwater, with her port side striking it. The first time she struck it was lightly enough that there was not much damage, but soon afterward she struck again, and this time was impaled on the submerged portion of the breakwater. There, the Berlin would remain, heavily listing to starboard, and completely exposed to the sweeping, heavy seas and storms that had battered her from her voyage from Harwich. Captain Precious, his crew, and the passengers remained calm in spite of the grave situation they all found themselves in. The passengers were all gathered on the deck since the ship was taking on water, and lifebelts were distributed. The ship's officers also ordered that lifelines be stretched across the deck of the ship so that people could hold on and not be swept away by the waves that were regularly sweeping the deck. There was an attempt to ready the lifeboats, but the waves smashed the boat shelter, the boat deck, and the boats, as well as members of the crew who were preparing them in a matter of minutes after the ship had hit the breakwater. Throughout this, the ship's engines were going full astern in the hopes that they would be able to draw the ship off the breakwater, but with no success. One of the sailors, a man named Fisher, had been on duty at the ship's telegraph, communicating with the engine room up until the collision with the breakwater, and he would report that throughout Captain Precious had been in control and directing the crew to help the passengers. The officers quickly rushed to the bridge to offer him their support. The first to reach him was the second officer, who was dispatched to help the passengers put on lifebelts. Fisher also joined in this effort, but said that as he left he could see Captain Precious, the pilot, and the second mate all standing on the bridge. At some point, the first officer and the second mate must have left the bridge, because Fisher saw them standing near the saloon 10 minutes after he had left the bridge. At this point, Captain Precious and the pilot were gone, washed overboard when one of the waves tore away both the bridge and the pilot house. Another man came to see Captain Precious before he was swept away, and this would later be a matter of much discussion. Captain Parkinson would tell Captain Howard, the Marine Superintendent, that though he was on the Berlin as a passenger, he had gone to the bridge to offer any assistance he could. He told Captain Howard that Captain Precious had told him that there was nothing more they could do to save the ship. The first officer had already come and reported the engine was full of water, and the flooding in the ship had forced the engineers to abandon their posts. Instead of helping the ship or crew, he had asked Captain Parkinson to go down as a sailorman and do everything possible for the passengers. This Captain Parkinson did, and he gathered several women and children together when a large wave had hit them and they had all been swept overboard. The problem was that the story that he had told Captain Howard did not match the story he had reportedly told Captain Precious's son when the two had met. Captain Precious's son would report with a good deal of indignation that Captain Parkinson had told him that his father had left the deck in the company of the pilot to speak to the chief engineer, and had turned to him and said, quote, "You take command of the ship." This, Captain Parkinson said, he had done until he had been swept overboard. This would have been a shocking disregard by Captain Precious to his duty in a time of crisis, as well as a moment of complete disregard to his experienced second officer who was also on the bridge at the time, and his son refused to believe it. His indignation was seconded by many other officers who knew Captain Precious also added their voices in, saying that it would have been completely out of character for Captain Precious to make such a statement, and that Captain Parkinson must have either misheard or misunderstood. Fisher ended the discussion by telling the newspapers that Captain Parkinson had departed from the bridge before he had, on his way to help passengers, while the captain and officers remained at their stations on the bridge. With very little more that could be done, most of the passengers were sheltered under the forward, under the saloon deckhouse. Many of them had been injured by falling as they climbed across the ship and the waves battered them. The saloon deckhouse offered one of the few places on the ship where the waves could not reach them, but the safety proved to be deceptive. The stern of the ship was firmly on the rocks, and was steady, but there was nothing to hold the bow of the ship as the waves pounded against the Berlin. It was estimated to be at most 2 hours after the ship struck, and still before daylight, when the Berlin broke in half. A majority of the people on the ship, most of whom were sheltered in the forward part of the ship, were lost as the bow plunged into the angry seas. The remaining people who had not been in the deckhouse found shelter by the engine room as the water kept rushing past them down the corridor. Finally, knowing that they would need to find better shelter soon, they were able to get to the engine room skylight, which traveled through the boat deck. And there, the 25 remaining people on the Berlin hunkered down in the hopes of help arriving. The plight of the Berlin was quickly seen on shore. Indeed, her broken bow was resting very close to the steel frame light that was intended to direct ships safely into the new waterway. Help was trying to reach the stricken ship from the moment she had struck. The lifeboat, President Van Heel, was pushed out first, but it was followed by other lifeboats and tugs, many of which were privately owned, all hoping to render aid. The conditions were going worse instead of better, however, and none of the boats were able to get close to the wreck. The President Van Heel stayed out the longest and closest to the ship, still hoping that they might be of some use. They were forced to watch helplessly when the front half of the ship broke off with its screaming cargo of humanity, who they could offer no assistance to. Also watching in horror was the crew of the Clacton. They had almost met the same fate as Berlin when they reached the entry to the waterway, but they had been able to maneuver to safety. Once they were in a safer position, Captain Dale of the Clacton did his best to ease his ship closer to the stranded Berlin so they could help. Time and again they would get within a couple 100 feet of the Berlin, only to be driven back again. In the conditions they were facing, their lifeboats would not stand a chance. At one point, they tied all of the lifebelts on the Clacton to ropes and tried to float them with lines to the stricken ship, but the belts could not reach the Berlin. So long as they could see people moving on deck, they stayed nearby and tried to reach the ship, sometimes at the risk of their own ship and crew, but they could not see any movement after a couple of hours, and they gave up hope and entered the waterway themselves. The President Van Heel had slightly better luck in her quest to save lives. A couple of hours after the Berlin had split in half, they saw 4 people floating in the water, and the men in the lifeboat retrieved them. 3 of the people they pulled in were still showing signs of life. For the first time, the President Van Heel left her vigil so they could rush the survivors to doctors who had been brought in by tram for just such an eventuality after news of the wreck had spread. 2 of the rescued men passed away soon after they reached shore, but the third, Captain Parkinson, survived. For a time it was believed that he would be the only survivor from the Berlin. The people on shore could also no longer see movement. More remains were recovered by other tugboats soon after, but no more living were found in the water. Out of those who were recovered would be included the find that would capture the public the most. When they recovered the remains of Chief Steward Moore from the water, he was still clasping in his arms the remains of a 5-year-old boy who had been entrusted in his care for the voyage. Up until the end, he had not abandoned his duty. His friends would eventually erect a monument to him in the Dover Court churchyard at the cost of £100 in the shape of an anchor and wreath, with a child angel dropping flowers on the grave. The large number of remains, and only one person recovered who was still among the living, had not deterred the efforts of the men in the boats to reach the stricken Berlin. As night fell, they heard voices once more shouting from the wrecked ship, and so they knew that people remained on the ship. The effort to rescue them was going to have to wait until the next morning, though. The storm was still blowing fiercely, and in the darkness there was no chance of getting close to the ship and effect a rescue. On the Berlin, the people who had been huddled in the engine room skylight were diminishing. Sometimes the waves could still reach them, and the people who could not hold on were washed overboard. Sometimes, people who could hold on still fell victim to debris that was flung around by the water. The crew still felt some obligation to care for the passengers if they could, and noticing that the 3 women who remained were clearly suffering from the cold, 3 members of the crew who remained determined to try to reach the storeroom and bring up some brandy to warm them up. It was not to be. The entire ship was now full of water, and in making the attempt, one of the sailors was lost. They also had no food or drinking water. A few biscuits had been shared around at first, but those were soon gone, and they had to make do with some peppermint candies that one of the men had in his pocket. Water was even more dire, and they were taunted by the proximity of the fresh water tank that had supplied water to the cabins. The problem was that it was not made to be opened at deck level, and though they hit it with a spanner and with part of a chair, the tank refused to yield, and they were forced to give up on the idea of getting water from it. The cold was also a danger. Some of the remains of people who were found later on the ship during recovery work showed that they had almost certainly succumbed to the cold, rather than drowning or other injury. In the remaining shelter, there now only remained 5 members of the crew and 9 passengers, 6 of whom were women who had been traveling as part of an opera company. The 6 women took turns sitting on one another's laps for warmth, and allowed the men to warm their hands inside of their bodices, something that Fisher would later credit with being the only reason that his hands had still been able to hold onto a rope when the time came later, since they had started to show signs of frostbite. The women also did what they could to help one another keep their spirits up. As members of a German opera company, the best tool they had to do so was to sing together, and though no one else in the shelter understood German, Fisher would later say that it had a strong impact on all of them, and their ability to keep from falling into despair. The next morning, as rescuers were getting ready for further attempts, Prince Henry, consort to the Queen of the Netherlands, arrived on the scene of the disaster. Having looked through his glass and seen that signs of life were still present on the stricken steamship, he had told the men that he had come with that they would not be leaving until they had done something to help those on the Berlin. He joined the crew of the pilot steamboat, the Healesville, which was part of a small fleet of boats that was now attempting to reach the Berlin in company with the lifeboat President Van Heel. The first 2 attempts to reach the ship were once again failures. The storms had not stopped, and the would-be rescuers were beaten back, but at 1:30 in the afternoon, the wind had shifted, and it filled the captain of the President Van Heel with optimism. The rescue boats set out once again. Soon after they had left the shore, a heavy snow began to impact visibility, and the rescue attempt was delayed until it passed. Once it had, a boat was launched from the Healesville, manned by pilot apprentices, and that boat was towed by the lifeboat to the steel-framed light near the end of the breakwater that the Berlin had wrecked on. The people on the wreck had clearly been watching, because once the boat reached the light, and the men from the boat were able to climb up the steel frame of the light, people emerged from where they had been sheltering and formed a small group on the stern of the ship. It took several tries, but finally a rope was successfully passed from the tower to the deck of the shipwrecked vessel. One by one, the people from the wreck traveled down the rope, a difficult task for their cold and stiff hands. The men on the Berlin offered to allow the women to go first, but the women insisted that the men go first, and prove that it was safe. This work was delayed due to another heavy snow squall in the middle of the operation, which made it even harder to work and impossible to see anything over a few feet away. Even once all of the men had been safely passed to the pilot boat, 3 of the women declared that they were too weak to make the journey, and no matter how much their companions called for them to come, they refused. The people who were leaving the Berlin were far too weak to carry them by force, and could only leave them behind. Once they were in the boat, they were carried ashore by the Healesville, where Prince Henry was waiting for them on board, with gloves for all of them. He was also given credit by the crew of the boat for doing as much work as everyone else in hoisting the survivors to safety up onto the pilot boat and hauling on the line that connected the small boat to the pilot boat. The prince also took off his fur coat to drape over the shoulders of one of the victims, who looked as though she was particularly suffering. On shore, they were taken to a hotel where the innkeeper and his staff had already prepared large amounts of warm soup. The final rescue would not take place until the day after the first 11 people were taken from the wreck. 2 men, Captain Sperling and Captain Vanderstack, both captains of small fishing vessels, had been among those who had watched the rescue work unfold, and on learning that there were still people alive on the ship, the 2 men set out in a small steam tug. Once they reached the light, Captain Sperling jumped onto the raft that they had towed behind them, and used it to reach the place where the rope had been tied to the wreck the day before. It was still there, and he used it to climb onto the wreck. The deck was strewn with remains, but Captain Sperling found where the 3 women were huddled together under some of the boat skids. The 2 members of the opera company were delirious, but their maid, who was the 3rd person, was still coherent and able to assist Captain Sperling a little. The 2 delirious women fought Captain Sperling, but he was still able to get ropes around them and swing them along the cable to the breakwater. Once all 3 were on the raft, they were able to return to the steam tug, and they joined the other survivors at the hotel, where they too met with the kindest of care. The final count of the survivors of the Berlin was 15. 128 people in total were lost. It was a disaster that demanded answers, an investigation. And after questioning several witnesses, a board of inquiry determined that Captain Precious had made an error in judgment in attempting to enter the Waterway at all, considering the conditions the ship found itself in. There would be condemnation towards the Great Eastern Railway Company for caring about their timetable more than people's lives, but the station master who was in charge of connecting passengers from the Berlin to the connecting trains protested against this, saying that on the occasion that the Berlin was late, they simply had special trains take the passengers to their destination. This would not limit the liability of the company, and there would follow a flurry of lawsuits against the company by the loved ones of those lost on the Berlin. The Berlin itself would be destroyed by dynamite, too much of a navigational hazard to leave where she rested. In the meantime, the Dutch government drafted a new law which stated that all vessels of over 200 tons gross had to carry a rocket apparatus, something that might have saved many lives on the Berlin. The Berlin's destruction would only take place after all of the remains had been recovered, and most of them eventually would be, either by people climbing over the wreck or because they washed ashore. For some time, the newspapers would report as the grim cargoes were brought to England, and the flurry of funerals that followed. The tragedy was not the only thing that consumed the public mind, however. The heroics of those who had risked their own lives to try to save the people on the Berlin could not be overlooked. The lifeboat crew of the President Van Heel, Prince Henry, the crew of the Hellevoetsluis, and the 2 fishermen captains would all receive praise and rewards, both at home and in England, for how hard they had fought to ensure that the Berlin had not claimed more lives than she tragically already had.
For more information, please see the Marine Review from May 23rd, 1907, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.